I'm your host, Sean MacKenzie. Thanks for joining me once again on my channel on data engineering and data analytics. In this episode, we're going to continue in our Microsoft Access playlist with part 2 of looking at how to use list boxes. And in part 1, we showed how to create a list box and you bind it to some data and show some selections and then retrieve selections from the list box. And in this episode, we're going to show how to do multiple selections in a list box and how to get the values and retrieve those and store them back into our database. So without further ado, let's get to our Microsoft Access list boxes. Okay, so to get started, we're going to go back to this file that we worked with in our last episode where we created a candy table, a candy order table with some orders in it, and a form that allowed us to select some candy. And as you can see, we were able to bind it to our table, and we had many items in there, and we could select one of them at any given time, and that worked really great. So to continue on and look at our multi-select list box, some things are going to change in the way that we handle the data, and essentially what we're going to do is we're going to release the list box from its binding. So we're going to unbind it, and we're going to change a few things. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go in that other tab, and under multi-select we'll select simple, which means that items are just selected when or deselected as you click on them. And the other multi-select style allows you to make it so that you can hold down the shift key and click on them. But we're going to take the simple style, and as you can see, if we look at our table there in our orders, there's a single field for candy ID, so we can only put one item in there because it's an integer, and so that's not really going to work for us if we want to have, you know, like 2 or 3 items on one order and use a single list box for that. So in our simple example here, we're just going to store the candy ID numbers as a string or in a text field, and we're going to put commas in between the numbers. That's a very simple way of doing it. There are many other ways. You could create another table and store each item in a row, but in this case we're going to do a very simple one. We're going to go select our list box, and we're going to remove the field name from the control source, and that's going to change it to unbound, as you can see there. And so what we're going to do is now that we're unbound and we've got multi-select in there, we can go ahead and we can choose whatever candies we want from our list. And as you can see, when it's in simple mode, you can just click on an item to select it and click on it again to deselect it, and there are multiple selections in our list box, which is what we want to see. Now, just like we showed before, if you use your Control G, you can open the immediate window, and you can put in your question mark, and you can ask, you can request the value from the list box, just like we did last time. But if we do it the same way as we did last time, where we just ask for the value, you can see it says null, because the value of the list box itself is now null, but there are many selections in there, and the way to find the value for those selections is to use the items selected property. And so you can see we can get the count from that. So that says there's three items selected, and so that means if we want to ask what those values are, we can also do that. So I could say, what is the the candy form list box for candy, and I could say item selected, and I could put a number in, Now we'll say 0, 1, and 2 to make 3 items because it's zero-based counting here. So if I say 0, that gives me number 3, ID 3, which is the white chocolate. And if I go to the table, you can see that ID number 3 is the white chocolate. So it's picked up the first item as being selected. If I ask for the other numbers, I can find out those ones as well. So I can find the second item selected is number 1, and that says that it's item 5, and 2 is number 7. If I say 3, it gives an error. So we don't want to ask for items that are outside of the range, because we do know the range because we counted it, and then we can say, you know, from this number to this number. So that's great. I've got a nice form with a list box on it with multi-selections, and now I just need to be able to capture those selections and store them somewhere into our field that we created to store the numbers. And in order to do that, I will go back to the properties of our list box, and we're going to go to the after update event under the event tab, and we'll click on the ellipsis just like I did there, and that's going to give us our after update event. Now I'm going to come back to this after. I just wanted to show you that. But what we're going to do is we're going to create a function, and it's a function that's going to allow us to just say at any time, just give me the list of items that's stored in the list box, as opposed to having to go and, you know, get them from the list box manually each time. So what we'll do is we're just going to create a little function that does that. We'll say, you know, we'll get an LBX variable there as a list box, and then we'll dim our return string so that we have something to return when we ask for the function, or when we call the function. And we'll say set LBX equal to me LBX candy, because that'll just set a nice reference for us to work with that. And then then from there we can get some items, because we're going to get a sort of collection here, and we're going to loop through it. So we'll need 2 integers, and one for the item that we're on, one for all of the items. Then we'll set the LBX items equal to the list box, and we'll say the item selected dot count. And that's going to be really handy for us. So now we know how many items we have, just like we did when we were in the immediate window. And then once we have that, then we can cycle through all of the items and stop at the end just like we wanted. So in order to do that, we will do a for next loop. We'll say for long item is equal to 0 to the count minus 1. Remember, as we showed down below, that the count gives back the numeric count, but the actual positions is 0 based, and so you have to say 0 to long items minus 1. And then we'll go ahead and put this inside of an if then, so that if there aren't any selected items in there, we'll just go ahead and skip the for next on our items there. So we'll say if we've got more than one item that's selected in the selected items, then we'll go ahead and evaluate those. Otherwise, we'll just return sort of an empty string. So then we can say for each of those items, 0 to long items minus 1. We can say if the item is the first one, if long item equals 0, then we'll say that our return string is just equal to the LBX.item selected, and that 0. It'll be 0 as long item. Otherwise, put a comma after it. If it's anyone that's greater than that, you can say put a comma and then put the next item in there. And what that'll do is it's going to build us a nice little concatenated string, or a delimited string that has a comma in between each number, and we can use that later to put into our field, but also when it's in the field, we can read it and split it out into an array in order to load the list box, which I'll show in a little bit here. And then at the end of our function, what we'll do is we'll say that our function, lbx items, is equal to our return string that we just put together. So that way we can just sort of say, hey, our function is equal to that. We'll go back up to the top and we'll set, we'll initialize that variable into an empty string, so that if it doesn't ever get anything put in it, it'll return an empty string. And that is very handy for us. So I'll compile that, debug compile, just to make sure there aren't any glaring problems with that function. And then we can move on and we can use our after update event, which disappeared because I saved it and we didn't put anything into it. So we need to go back and get it again. So what we'll do is we'll go up here. We'll minimize our code window there, and we've still got our list box selected there. We can go ahead and choose the after update event again and click on the ellipsis and then the code builder, just like I showed before. And now we've got our after update event for our Candy list box again. So then we can sort of test out our function and get it to return a list of items. So we'll say dim stir items as string, and then make our stir items equal to lbx items, and then we'll message box that list just to tell us that it's actually working. So we'll save that, go to our form view, and that's perfect. So now we've got, each time I click on it, it's going to return what's in the list box. So it looks like that's working, and quite happy about that. So our little function to return the value seems to be working great. We can select and unselect as we want to, and now we're going to go and remove that list box, and we're going to put those items into our field instead. So we can go back to our code window, and we're going to remove that line that had the message box in it that we were using for testing, and now we can just put in me exclamation candy ID numbers is equal to str items, and that's going to set the value of that field each time that the box is changed. And so now I can go back to the form, and we can go to the form view, and now we can see down below there we've got 3 records with orders on them. So on order number 1, if I click on some of these guys here, I should see, if I go back to my table, my orders table, I should see those selections there. Now if I move to the second record, you can see it stays selected up above, but we haven't actually changed the values in there yet, so it won't do that update that we showed. So now you can see on the first row, it's 2 and 5 are the ones that are selected, and that's exactly what we want to see. If I add a couple more and I go back to my order table, you see it's not refreshed yet. In order to refresh it, I do have to move off of that record and then back again, and then you'll see that there's a refresh in there. You can actually throw a requery or refresh command into the code, and it'll do that for you, but I left that out for now. So it will get updated as you move off the record, just like the rest of your fields do. And we want to make sure that when we move off of the record and move to a new record, the list gets cleared, or it gets cleared and then populated with the right values from the stored record. And so in order to do that, we'll go to our form event. So you use that drop down at the top left there. It says it said LBX Candy in it, and now it says form because we selected form, and then we're going to select current. And what form current does is it fires an event when the record changed and you're on a new record. And so we can start populating some variables here. We'll say that our str items, in this case, at the moment that the form lands on the next record, it's going to go and it's going to populate that with whatever's in the Candy ID numbers there, and the field called Candy ID numbers. And then we'll do the same thing that we did before. We can message box that, and we'll put a couple of double quotes at the beginning of it with an ampersand, so that if it happens to be null, it'll concatenate that with an empty string, which will end up with an empty string that does remain as a string and it's not a null value, and that's going to work a bit better and not throw that error. And so now if I scroll off, you can see it did fire the event, but we did get an error, and it looks like I put a 1 after Candy there, typo. And so I'll remove that, I hit go, and you can see it came up with nothing as the value in the message box, and that's what we want to see. So as we scroll through, because those values that are there are actually the values that are on the very first record, because we didn't clear the list box, which is what we're going to do now. And as you can see, that one's empty there, and it should be empty when we scroll onto it from another record. So this one's empty. As you can see, the second row and the third row are both empty, but when we scroll to them, the box doesn't update. And but the first one has four items in it, and we do want to show those. So we're just getting a refresh problem on our list box that we're going to handle sort of with some coding here. So in order to do that, we'll bring up our code window, and we're going to take that message box row there, and we're going to remove that, and that'll allow us to start coding. So we're going to do some similar things to what we did before. So we're going to have an items long integer as well as an item long integer. We're going to cycle through sort of like the collection of rows in the list box, and then we're also going to cycle through the elements in an array, which we're going to create when we finally get the string from the row. But to get started, we've got our LNG items equal to the list count of our Candy list box, and we'll go ahead and set up that loop, and then we're going to go back up to our variables. We're going to create a couple new ones. We're going to create an array item, which a simple array item, which is kind of like a list if you come from other programming languages. And we're going to create two more long integers, one to hold the element count and one to hold the current element, and we'll use those in our loop here. Now, just ahead of our loop there, we are going to load that array. We could say our array for items is equal to split, and split will take the delimited string and it'll split it into an array and remove the commas, and then we can say our elements is equal to the upper bound of the array item list, which is a fancy way of saying that it's just the count of items in the list. Now from there, we're going to loop through, and what we're doing here is this loop that we're creating is the loop of all of the sort of rows in our list box. So we're going to, as we loop through, because we're doing kind of a refresh, at first we're going to set the selected, so whether it's grayed out or not, we're going to set the selected item equal to false, and that's going to sort of refresh it, and then we're going to check and see if any item should be set to, selected, and we'll set it accordingly. So it's just sort of a default value of unselected, and then we'll go ahead and grab our ID. As we go through our list, we don't know what the actual data ID or candy ID of the item is that's selected there in the list, or not selected, of that row. So we don't know if it's what the ID is, and so we can go get that by saying that the ID is equal to me lbxcandy dot column, and then 3 is the row, which is the 4th row, and then the item is the number of the row. And so we're sort of grabbing it by coordinates there, because this is one of the only ways that you can do this. And then we'll create another for next loop inside of that, which will just cycle through the elements of the selected items that we got from the record. And basically, if the item happens to be one of the selected items for that record, then we want to set the selected property equal to true, and that's what we're going to do. That's what we're going to do there. Then we'll put a end if on our statement there, and we can scroll up and see what we've got here. And I'll do a debug compile just to check for any glaring syntactical errors, and there does not seem to be any. So I'll put a couple comments on here. So first, we're clearing the row with that statement so that it is unselected, and then we will set it to true if the item is found in the array of items that was taken from the current row. And look that over, and then we can minimize our code window there. And then if I scroll to the next record, it fires it. Oh, and we did get an error. So we can see, here we go. So I think, yeah, so I'm trying to load an integer value, but that the ID in the ID column of the list box is not always an integer. Sometimes it's a string or something like that. So I'm going to change it to a variant, and a variant will allow it to use either an integer or a string or whatever, and the program should like that a little bit better, and that's really going to help us to see the items that are in there. So from there we can go ahead and minimize our code window again. So we've sort of built our matching, and I'll scroll to another row, and you can see it clears all of the items from there on each of the rows that has no selections. And when we go to the first row, there we go. Now we've got our selections have come from the record, and they are populated into the multi-select list box. And if I scroll forward off of there, or if I change the items and scroll off and then go back, you can see that the selections have changed for that one row, and that is what we want to see. I can select all 3 of the top on the second row and the bottom 3 for the last row, and I can scroll back through the records, and you can see that the selections have been retained and stored just the way we want them to be. And if I go to the order table, open that up, you can see the selections that have been made for that multi-select list box. And if I change them, or if I select all of them, say, and scroll off of that and then open up the table, you can see all of the items in in the list box have been selected. The ID numbers are all in there, and that is how you do multi-select list boxes in Microsoft Access. I hope you enjoyed today's discussion on how to do multi-select list boxes in Microsoft Access. If you like what you saw today, please give the video a thumbs up, and make sure to subscribe to the channel if you have not subscribed yet. Make sure to click the bell when you see the bell so that you'll be notified of any new content that I put up. If you have any questions or comments about what you saw today, please put those in the comment section below, and I'll do my best to answer any questions that you might have. Have a great day, have a safe day, and I'll catch you next time.